Hello, my name's Will. I'm doing some further little chats about my life and stuff. This kind of happened recently. I'm a real werewolf, by the way, and I'm giving over a number of interviews and time to explain myself and how I think and what I do and all these things to a documentary filmmaker. On the 9th of June, we're booked into, is it Pebble Mill Studios or something? Yeah, where I will be transforming live in front of a studio audience and some skeptics. So if I live that long, I will be there. But after giving out certain elements of what I've given out over the past few weeks and months, life has become a little bit more difficult. So I'm carrying on with just some bits and pieces. There's no monetization on this YouTube thing, but what Louis would like is if you could subscribe and like the video and maybe even comment. That means that the video will get higher up in the algorithms or something, and we really want this to get out there before it's too late. We also have a website, www.werewolf.host. If you could go and have a look at that if you want. There's transcriptions there and further information. And you could also speak to me or Louis on that website, and I have actually spoken to a few people on there who've left comments. So, yeah, it's up to you. So, this happened to me recently. I'm not very good with people, as you can imagine. So, yeah, I'll just tell you the story. I've written it down, so I am reading it. So if it sounds like I'm reading something, it's because I'm reading it, because it's quite a long story. It's just something that happened, and apparently this is the kind of thing that people want to hear about. So here we go. Do not fart in front of a werewolf. That should be some kind of motto for humans. Do not even fart in the vicinity of a beast. Honestly, I can smell something like 100 times or more better than you can. I have no idea. I've never measured it, but it's a lot. So can you imagine what a bad fart smells like to me? I mean, it's often impossible to cope with the stinks that you excrete just normally. If you are in a busy lift, do not think that it would be amusing to let one go. It's not always fun for you. To be honest, if I happen to be sharing a lift with you, you're just giving me a reason to hurt you. And I do not tend to need a big excuse to do that killing thing that you guys get so stressed out about. I remember, for example, being in this lift in London at some posh hotel or other. I really like posh hotels. I love staying there and treating myself. I know it's not a very werewolfy thing to do. I should be out in the middle of nowhere living in a log cabin. But actually, I like to be pampered, yeah? So, I remember this like London hotel. I won't say which London hotel because it's been fairly well covered up recently what happened there. I like posh hotels. I was discussing a bit of nostalgic past with my posit. My posit is my werewolf soul. He's a separate entity to me. He looks like a big wolf. We talk telepathically. He's invisible to humans. Other werewolves can see him. Yeah. And when I want to become the werewolf or the wolf, he becomes part of me. Our minds meld together and our bodies meld together, and we become the werewolf or the wolf. So he's just this little werewolf soul that sits outside me. So I was discussing a bit of our nostalgic past with my posit and having a bit of a giggle, really, in our heads. The hotel still had no idea that the elevator music... This hotel still thought that the elevator music was a good idea, so we were being kind of tortured or entertained by an instrumental synthesizer version of The Girl from Ipanema. You know the one. Da, 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 da. Fuck. The lift stopped and some fat tourists joined us. I think they were from some Middle Eastern country, as I automatically stereotyped them by the way they looked and the way they sounded. The father and mother were busy arguing in some shitty language. I did not recognise it, and that was really irritating me. I'm normally a very good, cunning linguist. The richly but badly dressed father was a short, chubby, dark-skinned guy in a Versace shirt and pale, pleated trousers. He was busy gesticulating and monologuing to his family as he entered the lift. This man really had no sense of style, but was one of those guys that thinks that if you buy all the most expensive stuff that you can, that they work together to make you look fabulous. Not so, I'm afraid, especially in this sad case. Most annoyingly, out of all the items he wore that displayed his shyness in choice were a pair of those stupid slip-on Italian shoes in patent leather. I mean, they hurt me so deeply they made my teeth ache. On top of all the shitty style choices that they betrayed, he had to add the ill intention of his fashion sense by the fuckers being patent leather blue. Fucking infuriating. You must know the shoes. I mean the ones with the shitty little tasseled leather-like fuckers on the front of them to punish my excellent sense of style and push my anger levels even further. He'd worn a brown woven leather belt with it. You have to wear matching leather. It's the rules. Now, to you fashionistas out there, you get it, but to those of you who have need of help in this area, this faux pas was a sin in anyone's world. All leather worn should always be the same colour. Oh, and the piece de resistance, or whatever the French say, was that he was hung in gold. A better description would be that he was dripping in gold. He had a real oyster Rolex on his arm, an actual real one. I thought they were a thing of nightmares. They are just expensive, bad taste. In addition to his fashionless, dense sense, he was a stupid, floppy moustache and long, thinning, dark hair scraped over his balding, greasy pate. The greasy hair was held in place by the grease that his many sebaceous grease glands on his greasy, grimy skin seemed to have ejaculated onto his scalp. Fen was giggling in the corner of the lift. That's my posit. He could see I was getting angrier and angrier. To add more pain to my tortured dark soul's bitter torment, he was also one of those guys that get sweaty in the most wonderfully air-conditioned situations. In this cool elevator, he had a repugnant sweat stains under each armpit and a nice one that was running down the crack of his pale pants. You know, down his ass crack. Yeesh! The sweat had gathered in his crotch and I could not take my eyes off it. It was intolerable pain and cruelty were being inflicted on me, my artistic aesthetics. More insults were being hurled at me by the rest of him. His posture was hunched and unsupported. He was also massively out of shape and disgusting to behold. He looked like a human-sized toad, an extremely unhealthy human-sized toad at that. His skin was the sallow yellow of the nicotine addict, and his breath had the overriding scent of stale smoke. He also quite noticeably held his hand in a manner that was missing either the prerequisite cigar or cigarette. I imagine it being a cigar. He had the level of classlessness. As the doors had opened and he'd entered the elevator, I got a tsunami of sensual sledgehammers that gave me all I needed to know about his idea of personal hygiene. It was so bad that it smelled like a smackhead tramp, and that, not even they would allow themselves to get half that stinky. As a rich, arrogant old arsehole, he probably never got complaints about the stench. It was difficult to deal with this miasmatic, sensual monstrosity before any other smells were added to the mix. Da 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 da. But he had added to the stink. He'd made the wrong decision by trying to hide his BO with half a gallon of some eye-bleeding scent that he'd liberally poured on himself. I think it was to mask the sweat, body odour, cigarette odour, and the garlic foulness that followed him like a mangy dog. The only plus was the foul odours were fighting each other, and they were all in a losing battle. I genuinely believe our friend Franz Haber would have employed the man's current odour concoction to attack the Allies in the trenches. The odorous aura had a life of its own, and it was currently trying to fucking kill me and my sense of smell as I regurgitated last night's prostitute into my mouth, standing at the back of the lift. I could also sense disturbingly that they had had sex that morning and realised that it was not with the next person to get in the lift, which was obviously his wife. I assumed by the looks of her, combined with the look of hate she had for him, that I could work out it was definitely his wife. She stepped into the lift and into the backed-up bog stench of a man. She was his bejewelled and bedazzled black-haired bonny bride. Although a bit jaded and beyond her beauty years, she still bore the bone structure and body of a bona fide bombshell. Maybe slightly exploded and used, but she had been a bombshell. Her hair was lifted and aggressively forced into a late 80s hairstyle, and she was plastered in thick makeup that hid her well over half a century. Well. Her face had no sense of expression, and when her eyes met mine, the plastic surgery and the Botox stole from her the ability to make any recognisable facial expressions of any kind. Her countenance was like a doll's mask cast upon her head. I bet she'd not smiled in 20 years, but not from want of trying, but from the fact that she couldn't. She was dressed very elegantly, but out of date by some 20 years. She was as classless as her husband, so wore the Louis Vuitton, of course. The statement red coloured soles were telling the world that these shoes were an expensive statement of no class. To back up this expensive lack of class, she was also coated in the prerequisite diamond shite that the poor, now rich, think that they have to wear to prove that they are rich now to those that are poor that they once were. I could sense her interest me and smell her start to get excited in all the wrong places. She must have been fired upon pills and hormonally placed on a whole new level for that minge munchy down there to work. I could also smell the fact that she'd had sex this morning, but that wasn't with her husband. She tried to smile at me over the top of her makeup mirror as she checked her mask, but she just reminded me of a stroke victim that needed a shit as her face rose and fell at the wrong places for an ill-attempted coquettish flirt. Next into the heady mixed walked the daughters. They were very different in appearance. One was wrapped in a black burqa and was, guess, about 19 and emitting, let's say, a lovely scent. She had also had sex this morning, who with, I will not state out of decency. No, I don't have to do it. It was her dad's scent that lay upon her. Her attention fell on me when she saw me, my Tom Ford blue suit, and with her freshly coiffed hair, it was my usual stunning look. The other daughter was a face full of acne and a face full of bad attitude. She was chewing gum with the gum-chewing attitude, and her eyes were glued to a phone in a manner filled with a phone addict's attitude. She was maybe about 15 and a little copy of her mum. Well, it was definitely her mum in the lift, but the man's genes in her were definitely not her dad's. Da 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 da. Then there was a son. I think it had to be a son because I don't think this hotel allowed guests to bring pets. It was a spitting image of one of the flying monkeys from the classic Wizard of Oz film. He just had no wings, no tail, and no fur. The lack of these things meant that his little boy was much more horrifying than the monkey things ever could be. It even wore the little hat and the waistcoat over its Indian-style shirt and pants. I thought it would be silent, a saving grace, but this was not the case as it had a lolly the size of its head stuck in its gob. I hoped the sweet thing would mean it would be quiet, but no, it systematically licked, sucked, and masticated the candy in a decibel range that would outcompete the noise level finder at a Motorhead concert. I just wanted to kill it, make it live again, and then kill it another time. Posy and I just stood at the back of the menagerie and watched in distraught horror at the grotesques as they argued with each other. Well, they all spoke, yet did not communicate in any way with each other. It was crazy to watch. Posy looked at me. I looked at him. I had to hold back. This would be a difficult spot to do these people and make a clean getaway. It would end up being really messy and would be more trouble than it was worth if I wolfed out on them. Although it would have done the world a huge favour to have removed them from the world. I mean, I'd just left a mess in my room after having those two escorts around for dinner and breakfast. The sheets would never be the same. I even left a tip for the cleaner, which was unlike me. I could just not imagine the carpet ever being white again. Da 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 da. Then he fucking did it. The dad went quiet for the first time in 5 floors, as did everyone else. The looped track of the girl from Ipanema became audible again, and my super-sensitive hearing heard the gentleman hiss as Gaffs left his sphincter under a great deal of pressure. It was inaudible to humans as he had clenched first just enough to make it soundless. Sadly, because of this tuning of his instrument, the expiration of the bottom went on for a long time, a very long time. The sound produced was at a pitch that only dogs and werewolves could hear. My ears rang, and it was too much. His ass was directed at me, and the backwash hit me. What the fuck must he have been eating? I have no idea. I cannot describe the smell that assailed my nostrils, but I'm going to fucking try. It smelled like He'd eaten something that had died of yeast infection crossed with leprosy and childhood trauma. Once dead, that food had then crawled through his digestive system and been shit out. The shit had then been rolled around in more shit until the shit thought it smelled too much. It had then been kicked out of the septic tank for being too disgusting. After that, it had then been sat in a plastic bag for 4 days in full sunlight in the heat of the sun, and then again that shit had been consumed by something that had died from smallpox and that had marinated in rhino bile, and yet more shit. Then they'd bury it in a hole. That hole had been flooded with horse piss and left for 6 months and dug up again. Then he'd eaten it all up again. I was just unable to cope anymore. I could not deal with it. So I wolfed out. I expanded in the back of the elevator. It was a huge elevator, and I managed to change into my werewolf form without my congregation noticing. The only witness to my change was the monkey boy, who actually managed to continue sucking and munching on his fucking lolly while looking at me. The only difference in demeanour was that his eyes got a little wider, and he began to tug on the material of his father's pants with some distress. Dad was talking, so he did not want to be disturbed, so he flicked the boy's hand without looking at him as he rattled on with his rambling rant. The boy stopped the tugging in response to the sting of having his hand slapped and stared at it for a moment. All that lolly licking action stopped and he focused on his sore hand. Momentarily I had been forgotten. Then suddenly he remembered there was a big, fuck-off, scary thing stood looking at him, and he started tugging at the trousers with much more urgency. His tugs were being ignored, so I slowly reached forward and delicately grabbed the kid's head in both claws, smothering any noise that he could produce with my clenched paws. I then slowly drew him towards my mouth, where I treated him much like the lollipop that he'd stuffed in his own gob. The little lad did not make any sound or try any semblance of struggle as I removed his head. I sheared through his neck with my razor-like canisials. Once the head was removed, I chewed the tasty morsel whilst lapping and consuming the blood which flowed from the arteries, pumping it into my throat. He tasted divine for such a young vintage. Somehow, I managed to carry out this whole operation without disturbing any of the occupants in the elevator. The family had somehow still not noticed me, and I even managed not to get blood on the carpeted floor as they continued to face forward and stare at the doors in mucho boredom. I took the now headless corpse from my maw and held it aloft by the seat of its pants. As I did so, I extended a claw and tapped the sister in the burqa gently on the shoulder to get her attention. Her head and body turned, and her eyes met the headless corpse of her little brother. She gasped out loud as I grabbed and dragged her towards me. Oh, how she squealed so delightfully. To silence her, I bit into her skull, crushing it and getting a solid grip so that I could shake it hard to remove it from the neck of the girl. The conversations of the others suddenly stopped at the sounds of my feeding. The remaining 3 idiots slowly turned and met eyes with me as I pinned the woman's body to the floor and ripped strips of flesh from it. It was the first time that silence had hit the trio, and it was such a fucking relief that they were quiet. But in the silence, the fucking girl from Ipanema. They stood there and gasped. The makeup mirror of the mother hit the floor of the lift in slow motion. The Compax powder now mixing with the blood of the boy and the girl. Fuck's sake, that stain will never be taken out of that. Next, the phone addict tore her eyes away from her screen. Her attention was on me, and her jaw dropped, and with it, the gum that she was so busy devouring fell to the floor, adding to the detritus, is that the word? Already littering it. This is one of my favourite moments in any kill or scare, that moment of the realisation of truth. Then the father did something very unexpected. He pushed his way between his daughter and wife and stood bravely in front of his remaining family with his arms raised in a fighting stance. Well, in what he thought was a fighting stance. The 2 remaining women now faced the doors of the cab and tried to press all the buttons to stop the thing and open the door. All the lights on the board came on, and I was gratified to see the ladies respond in a manner not of screaming panic, but in calmish, let's escape way. The father still stood before me, fist raised high, his face set for a fight. The little greasy fuck was going to try and box me. Brave or stupid? Brave or stupid? Fucking both. I moved forward to engage with the man, and he swung on me. The first looped in a slow motion towards my head, and I let it impact on my jaw and faked a flinch response to the contact for a moment. For a moment, I saw the hope in the little man's eye. He actually thought that he hurt me. I let out little wolfy giggle. I raised my posture and expanded to fill as much of the space as I could within the cab, and then I roared. It was one of my particular best, and with it came spittle and a blast for the little man as he stood before me. I brought my hands to bear in front of his body, flexing my giant claws. My roar ran out of steam, and it ended. The girl from Ipanema came back into the silence. Da, 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 da. I expected the little man to crumble and fall to the ground in a snotty mess. Nope. Not this slimy wart. He stood as tall as he could before me. His chest was rising and falling heavily, his bloodstream an intoxicating mixture of stress hormones and nicotine, but he was there to fight and protect his family. Most impressive. Nothing for it. This was annoying me. He should be fucking terrified, not ready to fight. I open hand slapped him in the side of the body. He covered quite well, showing some level of defensive boxing skill, but the blow was like a strike from a demolition ball smashing into an ant's nest. I felt the bones of his arm break first as the impact landed and the body started to move from the impetus of the strike. The force continued to move through the arm as it shattered the limb and collapsed it against his body. As the strike continued its course into the side of his body, I felt the ribs break and felt his torso crush against my fist. His body then developed the sideways momentum that I gave it by the blow, and because of physics, it shifted violently, not flying to the side of the cab, but folding around my hand. His head whiplashed as he curled around my fist. His neck folded as the vertebrae were torn apart, and with the violence of the movement, it was great. His skin began to tear before it burst somewhat like a water balloon at the end of the impact. As my hand and arm continued through the arc of its movement, it threw the spattered body at the wall of the lift and made a lovely piece of fetid artwork that I will remember in my mind's eye for all eternity. It truly was a thing of beauty. A torn and fragmented man smeared across the wall, a shame that I will never be able to actually see it in reality again. Some of the remains of the man had sprayed over the two women who stood with their backs to me. Blood, flesh covered them, and the doors, it was great. And the doors where they were frozen in their actions, they tried to comprehend it had just happened. Silence again. Da, 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 da. Both crying and bubbling in fear, the two women turned very slowly towards me and screamed in a spine-tingling manner. I smiled and moved towards them as they tried to squeeze back into the corners of the lift. They seemed to be trying to dig their way through the metal walls using their shoulder blades to rend holes for their escape. I stood over them as they continued to scream. I wanted to see how long they could keep up the screaming before it faded. I love this. They had their inner monkeys yelling and screaming to try and scare off the nasty wolf. I love the power trip of seeing how long they could actually keep up the noise before they just ran out of energy to scream anymore. It took a while before they ran out of steam to scream. Then they just sat there shaking and sniffing, hiccuping now and again, not knowing really how to react. As I moved towards them, blood dripping and grizzling, they started to yell and scream again. They tried harder to dig through the walls behind them, and I sniffed them closely. As they flinched away, I reached and pushed the emergency stop button with my long, extended claw. The fear in their eyes was just beautiful. And what I did was I just ripped the panel out of the wall. I then became fascinated with the painted scene on the doors. I get lost in art. Not only had this accidental happening created the mural of the moribund man, but it created a photo negative of the women when they stood before the doors. There were two clear outlines on the wall, which were where the women had stood when the blood had sprayed across the elevator. It was like something out of a Saturday morning cartoon. The two outlines perfectly formed from the clotting remains of the man. The red liquid and gore was satisfyingly pooling on the floor of the lift. The outlines made were near perfect. You could even make out the high 80s haircut in all its glory. Awesome stuff. I really wish I had a camera that I could use in my wolfie form. Sadly, they're not made. I suppose not a huge market for them, but it was always have a glorious memory in the head of those fantastic pieces. I stood and was lost in my thoughts for a while. As a werewolf, I could sense this work in so many more ways than a human could normally. I could sense the piece as no human could see it. You have no idea of the things that you miss in the world. You cannot imagine the horrors and the wonders to behold through the senses of the werewolf. The intercom of the lift must have still been functional as a voice lifted me rudely from my artistic wonderment. "Hello, this is Perkins, the hotel manager. Please don't worry, we will soon have you out of there. Could you please tell me why you pressed the emergency stop button?" I looked at the two women and, motioning with my hand, invited them to answer the intercom. Neither would move, so I split back to my human form and stood naked and unabashed in front of mother and daughter, as, God intended humans to be seen. I was a god to behold in my divine bloody nakedness. I pressed the button and replied to Perkins as my posit stifled a laugh. "Hi, Perkins, was it?" I turned and smiled at the two women. "We seem to have a werewolf issue here. I'm afraid one of your guests has turned into a werewolf and has slaughtered 3 annoying cunts in the lift and is about to kill 2 more annoying cunts before you get us moving again." And then I smiled at the woman. Then I remembered my training. "Oh yeah, Roger, over and out," before releasing the button. There was static from the other end of the comms. Perkins had pressed the button to talk but had got no further in his thoughts. I waited patiently and then looked at the women and smiled. "Okay, now it's your turn to be werewolf fodder. I'm going to kill you in the most horrendous, torturous way." I changed back into my werewolf shape to do my murdering. I laughed as I moved forward and began to rip and tear. I knew how to have fun. The police would have a lot of sorting to do to separate the remains of these 5 individuals into 5 individual piles of person. It was so exciting. Da, 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 na, 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 na,